they whispered. Wait till she dies, then we split it. I was awake during surgery. The words floated into the sterile light above me like dust caught in a sunbeam, soft and casual, almost bored. I remember the sound of the monitor ticking beside me, steady, obedient, as if my heart were still trying to prove I was worth keeping alive. The anesthesia hadn't taken the way they thought it had. I could not move or open my eyes, but my mind was perfectly clear, pinned inside my own body like an insect under glass. I had heard my daughter-in-law's voice first, sharp, efficient, the way she spoke when she was arranging things. Then my grandson's laugh, short, careless. They were standing just outside the curtain. The nurse had stepped away for a moment, and they must have thought the hum of the machines made them safe. She'll be fine, the surgeon had said earlier. Just a mild sedation. Fine. Yes, I was fine enough to listen while they made plans for my death. I remember thinking that the clock on the wall would outlast every one of us, that the light above my face had seen 1,000 such scenes and forgotten them all. When I woke later, they were sitting beside my bed, smiling with the strained brightness people use at funerals before the tears are allowed. You gave us a scare, my daughter-in-law said, touching my hand. Her nails were perfect, pale pink, neat as a ledger. My grandson looked up from his phone only long enough to say, "Glad you're okay, Grandma." His eyes didn't reach me. They hovered somewhere above my shoulder, like he was already calculating something beyond the room. I wanted to ask if he'd enjoyed the conversation during my operation, but my throat was raw from the tube, and the words refused to form. So I smiled. That's what women like me do. We smile through betrayal, because it's quieter that way. When the nurse came to check my pulse, I asked her softly if my family had been waiting long. "Oh, yes," she said kindly. "They were right outside, talking about your recovery plans. You're lucky to have people who care." I almost laughed, but the pain in my chest reminded me that laughter was a luxury. I looked at the IV line feeding clear liquid into my arm and thought how trust dissolves the same way. Slowly, invisibly, until there's nothing left but the tube. I am 81. I live in a small, rented apartment above a laundromat in what used to be the better end of town. The windows rattle in the wind, and the floor leans slightly toward the street. But it's mine, paid for with a pension no one can sign away. I water the same spider plant every morning, the one that used to hang in my kitchen before they sold the house. My daughter-in-law said the new owners weren't sentimental, as if I were the sentimental clutter she meant to discard. That plant is the only living thing that's followed me through every address, every loss, every polite eviction disguised as a better arrangement. The hospital sent me home 2 days after the surgery. "You'll need rest," the doctor said, smiling without looking. My family insisted I stay with them for a week, just until I felt steady again. I agreed, though my stomach tightened at the thought. Their house smelled of lemon polish and distance. The guest room was small, cold, impersonal, a holding space between usefulness and absence. They had labeled the drawers with tape, as if I might forget where to put my things. On the second night, while they thought I was asleep, I heard them in the hallway. "She's sharp," my daughter-in-law said quietly. "But we need to handle the finances soon. She's still got the bonds in her name." My grandson murmured something about timing. I lay there staring at the ceiling, tracing the cracks like fault lines, wondering how long they had rehearsed this concern, this strategy of care. In the morning, my daughter-in-law brought me tea on a tray, her smile crisp as starch. "We've been thinking," she began, setting the cup down. "You shouldn't have to worry about paperwork at your age. It's stressful. Maybe we can help manage things. Just streamline it all for you." I thanked her, because that's the language of survival for women who outlive their usefulness. Gratitude. I drank the tea even though it tasted faintly metallic, not because I feared poison, that would have required passion, but because I wanted to remind myself how bitterness feels when swallowed on purpose. When they left for work, I walked slowly through the house. Every photograph on the walls was new, no trace of me, no trace of the years when I'd paid their rent, cooked their dinners, held their baby so they could sleep. My reflection caught in a silver frame between their wedding portrait and a picture of the dog. And for a moment, I looked like a ghost visiting someone else's life. I found my handbag on the dresser, the one thing that still smelled like my perfume. Inside, I kept a folded paper, soft from years of being unfolded and read again. The deed to my old home. They'd pressured me to sell it, said it was too much responsibility. I believed them. I sold it, and the money disappeared into accounts that now bear their names. I had signed every document they placed before me because love makes fools of the elderly the same way it once made fools of the young, only slower, with more paperwork. That afternoon, I sat by the window and watched the mail carrier slip envelopes through the slot. Bills, offers, the usual vultures in paper form. Among them, a pale blue card from my doctor's office. Follow-up appointment confirmed. I held it like a secret because I had decided I wouldn't tell them. They had taken enough. My home, my trust, my silence. They wouldn't take my recovery, too. I would walk into that clinic alone, steady on my cane, and prove that I still existed beyond the space they'd written me into. At night, I replayed the voices from the operating room. Wait till she dies. Such simple cruelty. They hadn't said it in anger or desperation. They'd said it the way people discuss the weather. Inevitable, unremarkable. It was the calmness that pierced deepest. The assumption that my end was merely a line item waiting for resolution. I realized then that I'd been dying in installments for years, not from illness, but from erasure. Each time they spoke over me, corrected my memory, rearranged my possessions, they buried another small part of who I was. Now, in the dim light of my rented room, I can still hear the rhythm of that monitor from the surgery, the steady beep that insisted I was alive even when no one wanted to admit it. I keep that sound in my head like a metronome for courage. People think survival is about the body refusing to stop, but it's more than that. It's about the mind refusing to agree with those who already mourn you. I drink my tea, feed my plant, fold my blanket just so, not out of habit, but defiance. If I have learned anything at 81, it's that cruelty rarely arrives with fangs. It comes wearing kindness, carrying casseroles, speaking softly about what's best for everyone. And sometimes it leans close to your hospital bed, believing you can't hear, and divides your life before you've even finished living it. But I heard them. I heard every word. And that means the story isn't over yet. Not by a long stretch. The defining act of betrayal came dressed as a routine errand, the kind of quiet arrangement families make when they want to look generous while tightening their grip. My daughter-in-law suggested we go to the bank together, just to update some information. She spoke with that bright, managerial tone she used on waiters and delivery men, the kind that sounds like politeness, but smells faintly of command. I had no reason to refuse. My body was still recovering, and she had been driving me to appointments. We sat in the car, her perfume too sweet, her music too loud, while she chatted about interest rates as if she were tutoring a slow student. At the branch, she guided me toward the desk of a young man in a navy suit who smiled at me as if I were made of glass. "We're just simplifying a few things," she said quickly before I could open my mouth. "Mother-in-law wants to ensure the estate is secure." Estate. How easily they used that word, as if I were already a line of inheritance, not a living woman who still balanced her own checkbook. The banker slid papers toward me, paragraphs dense with small print. I felt the tremor in my hand start, the one that comes with fatigue, and she reached over, steadying my wrist, smiling for the camera in her mind. "Don't strain your eyes, Mom," she said softly. "I've gone through it already." I glanced at her reflection in the glass partition. Her smile didn't reach the eyes. I read what I could, words like transfer, trustee, irrevocable, and beneath them, the unmistakable impression of removal. My name shifted from owner to beneficiary, a title with no teeth. I felt a heat rising behind my ribs, not from anger exactly, but from humiliation. The old familiar kind that tells you someone thinks you're too fragile to notice you're being erased. I signed nothing. I folded my hands in my lap and said my pen had leaked in my purse. She frowned, her voice tightening around the edges. "We can come back tomorrow," she said, but her fingers drummed against the counter like a warning. On the drive home, she turned the conversation toward my health. "You've been tired," she said. "It's natural to need help." The words were chosen carefully, each one polished to sound like care. I watched the streetlights flicker across her face as we drove through the afternoon traffic and thought of the moment in the hospital when she whispered my expiration date. There was a precision in that whisper, an assurance that she had already practiced the story she would tell once I was gone. "She passed peacefully," she would say. We were right there with her. The scene was rehearsed long before the curtain rose. That evening, my grandson came by under the pretext of checking the mail. He walked through my apartment with the air of a surveyor inspecting property lines. "You should think about getting rid of some of this," he said, pointing at the framed photos on the wall. "Makes the place look cluttered." The photos were nothing special. Me and his grandfather in front of our first house, my children at Christmas, a snapshot of him at 7 with a missing tooth. But he looked at them as if they were obstacles to be cleared. "Less to pack when you move," he added. Move. The word landed softly, but carried the weight of exile. I asked where exactly I was supposed to move, pretending confusion to buy time. "Somewhere comfortable," he said quickly. "Closer to care if something happens." I smiled and asked who would care for me. He hesitated just long enough for the truth to flash between us before he looked away. "You know what I mean, Grandma." I did. I always did. Later that night, I sat at the kitchen table with the folder of documents they had left on the counter, each page a small betrayal wearing the mask of efficiency. I read slowly, tracing the fine print with my fingertip, feeling the language like sandpaper, phrases about managing assets, limiting burden, preventing misallocation. Nowhere was the word love. Not once. I folded the papers neatly, placed them in an envelope, and wrote across the front in large letters, "To be opened after I am gone." Then I slid it into the drawer beneath the cutlery where no one would look. 2 days later, I went for my follow-up at the clinic, alone. The nurse was surprised. "Your family didn't come?" she asked. I told her they were busy, which was true in the same way an empty room is quiet. It simply lacks anyone who cares to fill it. During the examination, I asked the doctor if there had been any complications during the surgery. He hesitated, glancing at the chart. "You were awake longer than expected," he admitted finally. "There was an issue with the anesthesia dosage, but we corrected it. You didn't experience any pain, did you?" I told him no, though pain is not always physical. He nodded, relieved, unaware that the error had delivered a revelation no medical chart could record. I left the office with my steps slow but steady, feeling a clarity I hadn't known in years. That night, the phone rang. My daughter-in-law's voice came through, smooth as cream. "We've been thinking about getting your paperwork sorted soon," she said. "It'll give you peace of mind." Peace of mind, a phrase that always precedes theft. I told her I wanted to think about it. There was a pause, then a sigh that carried the fatigue of someone who's done pretending. "You don't want things to get complicated," she said. "We're just trying to help." I hung up before I said something that would reveal I'd already seen through the play. In the days that followed, the atmosphere around me shifted in small, almost invisible ways. My grandson stopped calling me grandma and started saying she when speaking to his mother in my presence. They spoke about me like an object, a delicate one perhaps, but still a thing to be managed. When they visited, their eyes flicked toward the jewelry box on my dresser, the antique clock on the mantel, the envelope of bonds I kept in the drawer. The house grew quieter after they left, the silence dense and meaningful, like air before a storm. I began locking the door even when I was home. The catalyst wasn't a single event, but an accumulation, a slow pressure that finally shaped the decision to act. It came to a head one gray morning when the mail brought an envelope stamped with the logo of a law firm I recognized from my husband's estate. Inside was a letter addressed not to me, but to the Harrow family. It was a courtesy copy of a request my daughter-in-law had filed, seeking power of attorney in anticipation of health decline. The date on the request was the day after my surgery. I read the lines twice, my pulse steady, my breath shallow. They had begun carving up my life before the anesthesia had even worn off. I sat for a long time with the letter in my lap, the morning light crawling slowly across the table, and I felt something I hadn't felt in decades. Not rage, but an old, cold precision I remembered from my working days, when the only way to survive was to act before anyone noticed you'd seen the knife coming. That afternoon, I dressed carefully in my navy coat, the one they said was too heavy for the season, and walked to the small branch library 3 blocks away. The librarian, a woman with tired eyes and ink-stained fingers, looked up from her desk as I approached. "Can I help you?" she asked. I handed her the letter and asked if she knew a good lawyer who still believed in paper more than in signatures over email. She studied the document, her brow furrowing, and said quietly, "They're trying to take everything before you can say no." I nodded, not surprised, only grateful to hear the truth spoken out loud. "Do you want me to make a copy?" she asked. "Please," I said. "One for me, one for them. But they'll get theirs at the right time." When I left the library, the wind had picked up, carrying the smell of rain. I walked slowly, feeling the ache in my knees, the heaviness of my purse against my side. Inside, it was the copy of the letter, the first piece of evidence in a case I hadn't planned to fight, but would now see through to the end. I reached the corner and watched the traffic crawl past, the lights flickering red and gold on the wet asphalt, and thought how betrayal always begins in the language of love. It starts with, "We're worried about you," and ends with a signature that erases your name. But they had forgotten one thing. I had heard them. I was awake then, and I am awake now. And that small accident of anesthesia, the one the doctor apologized for, had saved more than my life. It had saved what was left of my dignity, and I would not let them divide it. The quiet worsening arrived the way winter does in a year that refuses to admit it is already cold, one shallow degree at a time, until you notice the breath leaving your mouth in little ghosts and realize the season has changed without raising its voice. And that is how the days began to tilt after the bank papers I refused to sign. After the clinic confirmed the anesthesia mistake, and the part of me that had always been polite slid back from the edge and watched with new, careful eyes. The first sign was trivial on its face. A small varnished box where I used to keep my spare keys vanished from the bowl by the door and reappeared 2 days later under a folded dish towel in a drawer that I never used. And when I asked my daughter-in-law if she had seen it, she smiled with an indulgent patience that made my throat burn and said perhaps I had reorganized and forgotten. A phrase that would be repeated in the weeks to come with the rhythmic confidence of a lullaby meant to put the old to sleep. Then a call came from the pharmacy to confirm my new prescription plan, some consolidated delivery service I hadn't approved, and when I requested clarification, the representative paused in the way people do when they are reading a screen and said my grandson, as an authorized family contact, had streamlined my refills for safety, which meant the medications would now arrive at their house for pickup because someone should be there to sign. And when I said I was someone, the line went quiet, just long enough for me to hear the script reshuffle and a gentler voice say, "We just want what's best." And I could almost see the boxes on the screen ticking themselves. Elderly, dependent, compliant. The apartment began to develop new habits, the thermostat adjusting itself to cooler settings in the night, the answering machine deleting messages before I returned, the mailbox offering fewer letters and more glossy brochures for continuum of care communities where the bathrooms were large enough for 2 attendants and the gardens safe and fenced. And I started finding things that weren't there before. A magnet from a facility an hour away. A pamphlet slipped inside the library book I had left on my table, as if the pages had grown an extra chapter, the margins filled with suggestions about transitioning with grace. Visits shifted in tone, too. No longer spontaneous, but scheduled and oddly performative. My daughter-in-law arriving with a clipboard peeking from her tote and saying she'd brought a few forms to keep on hand. While my grandson drifted through the rooms with a measuring tape he swung like a toy, pausing to note the width of my dresser and the exact length of the dining table his grandfather had scraped his knuckles building in the old garage. And when I asked why the measurements mattered, he grinned without warmth and said he was learning interior planning, which he pronounced the way his mother said estate, a word that transformed a life into square footage and resale value. They started using phrases that sounded neutral but landed like tiny cuts, telling me that I seemed overwhelmed, that it might be relieving to unburden myself of tasks like bill paying and correspondence, and when I declined, their faces settled into that expression used for weather, a shrugging acceptance that still manages to blame the sky for raining, after which I would discover a helpful change already implemented, a utility placed on autopay from a new account I hadn't authorized, a mail forward request to simplify delivery that rerouted half my envelopes to their address until I went down to the post office with my cane, and a voice that had forgotten how to tremble and reversed it under the fluorescent lights, while the clerk looked at me with a mixture of pity and admiration, and slid a stack of forms across the counter, as if handing me a shield. Neighbors began to know things I hadn't told them. A woman from the end of the hall bringing soup and saying she'd heard I was moving soon to a lovely facility. And when I asked who told her, she laughed the way people do when gossip dresses as care and said everyone knows these things eventually. The building hums. And I thought of the operating room hum, the way machines keep rhythm for any story you want to set against them. And I realized a new chorus had already started outside my door. A song with my name in the refrain, sung by people who had never once carried my groceries up the broken elevator or sat with me when the winter light pressed its blue shoulder against the window. The small indignities multiplied, not catastrophic enough to rally the cavalry, but relentless in their erosion. The kind of drip that carves stone, like the day my bus pass was missing, and I arrived late to the library, only to find a message waiting from a social worker who had stopped by my apartment unannounced at my family's request to conduct a routine wellness check, which is a phrase that means you are a suspect in your own deterioration and must provide alibis in the form of crisp answers and steady gaze. And when she returned the next morning with a smile as precise as a ruler, I made her tea and told her the date, the governor's name, the prescription dosages, the year my husband died, the Latin motto of the convent school where I learned to diagram sentences, because syntax, like a will, is a way of putting things in order so no one can move them after you leave the room. She left with a pamphlet anyway, and an expression I recognized from my days at the city office where I filed permits and watched men explain to me that my own handwriting was wrong, an expression that says the file is open and waiting to be filled by someone with a better story. And I understood that if I did not narrate myself daily, line by deliberate line, other mouths would do it for me in a language that erased my subjecthood, that made me an object on a checklist beneath smoke alarm battery replaced and above estate inventory initiated. On Sundays, they began driving me to their house after church with the reasoning that I must be lonely, and the afternoons unfolded like polite interrogations disguised as family time, with a plate of sliced fruit on the table and a laptop open nearby, where tabs multiplied for downsizing strategies, senior safety, and how to talk to resistant elders, while a television murmured about real estate and a glass jar on the mantel collected coins labeled Vacation Fund in my grandson's blocky handwriting, and I wanted to ask if the fund included my dining table, my ring with the missing emerald, my years. But I found my mouth too careful around the words, and so I watched them perform their care, while I practiced breathing like a patient in recovery who has learned that the muscle most likely to atrophy is the one that forms the sentence, no. The mail kept bringing its small rehearsals of my absence, an invitation to a tour of a facility where the brochures featured gray-haired women smiling at puzzles, a corporate letter thanking me for considering transfer of beneficiary status, a congratulatory note addressed to my daughter-in-law for becoming primary contact. And in response, I began making my own rehearsals of presence, copying documents at the library and placing originals in plastic sleeves, opening a post office box whose key I hung from a ribbon inside my blouse like an amulet, moving certain photographs into the hollow behind the stove panel the way other women hide cash in a freezer, telling the pharmacist I would pick up in person, and that any family member who spoke for me had better bring me along or walk out without the bag. And each time I did one of these small, defiant things, I felt the balance shift a fraction, like the level in those spirit tubes carpenters use to find true center, the bubble trembling toward equilibrium, even as hands pressed down on one end of the board. My daughter-in-law reacted by turning up the warmth in her voice and the speed of her plans, calling to say she'd booked tours just so we can see options, leaving voicemails in which she lingered on the words, "your comfort," the way salespeople linger on limited time, arriving with a tray of neatly labeled folders containing printouts she had highlighted in cheerful colors. And when I mentioned I had an appointment of my own, she tilted her head the way a pediatrician does before telling a child that the needle will sting just a little, and asked with whom, her pen poised, as if my answer were a misbehaving fact she could correct. The first escalation was not a fight, but a narrowing corridor, a steady ushering toward the door with smiles and brochures, the same corridor I had felt on the gurney when voices, thinking themselves unobserved, agreed to divide my life like a pie they had baked by the sweat of their entitlement. And the more I replayed that whisper, the more I noticed its cousins in ordinary sentences. How "we'll handle it" means give us the papers. How "you deserve rest" means stop resisting. How "we love you" can be bent into the shape of a gentle hand at your back, pushing you into the van. They have already warmed up for the drive to a place with wide hallways and a calendar of crafts. In the late afternoons, when the laundromat below my window exhaled the smell of warm soap and coin metal, I sat at my table and wrote lists on yellow pads, not of objects to give or keep, but of sentences I wanted to remember when the chorus grew loud again. I pay my own rent. I set my thermostat. I choose my doctor. I decline the tour. I am not a beneficiary while breathing. I am the owner of my hours. And under those, I wrote the petty things they could never inventory. The way sunlight stains the spider plant's leaves a richer green at noon. The precise crack in the teacup where my lips have learned to land so as not to bleed. The rhythm of my own walk to the library. 4 lights, a bakery, a dog that barks twice, a corner with a lamppost that leans, the left turn at the brick church whose bell is always 3 minutes late, small coordinates that map the country of a life still inhabited. When sleep thinned, I heard new sounds beneath the old ones, the cautious footfall of doubt, the hushed conference of plans in the hallway outside my apartment, when they thought I could not distinguish their silhouettes through the peephole. And each sound taught me a lesson I should have learned sooner. That kindness without respect is only choreography. That concern without consent is a seizure in polite clothing. That love which requires your disappearance is a ledger, and you are the asset marked ready to liquidate. And because the evening was growing long and the season had settled fully, I folded my lists, slid them into the pocket of my navy coat, and stood to make tea, telling myself that even when roads funnel you toward one direction, there is always a small path punched through the hedge by those who refused to be herded. And if my hands shook as I held the kettle, it was not fear, but a rehearsed energy, the tremor before the note, the old instrument remembering the music it had not yet finished playing. The shift began not with a grand realization, but with a small act of disobedience that no one saw. On a Tuesday morning glazed with weak sunlight and the smell of detergent from below, I put on my navy coat, the one they said made me look old-fashioned, and walked out without calling to inform anyone. I told myself I was only going to the library to return books, but inside that modest purpose was the pulse of something older and hungrier, a need to confirm that my choices still made sound when they hit the air. The streets felt different that morning, sharper in their edges, as though every lamppost and parked car were watching to see if I would turn back. At the corner bakery, a woman in a flour-dusted apron greeted me by name, not out of obligation, but because she remembered I liked the rye with caraway. That small remembering cracked open something in me that had been sealed under layers of supervision. I carried the loaf under my arm like proof that recognition could still come without a ledger attached. At the library, I returned my books to the front desk, but instead of leaving, I asked for the name of the local legal aid office. The librarian, a thin woman with bright hair pinned up in a rush, looked at me carefully and wrote an address on a slip of paper. "They're decent people," she said, "and they still do things the old way, with ink and witnesses." I folded the paper and slid it into my wallet next to a photograph of my husband, taken in 1972, the year he still believed the world could be repaired with diligence and patience. I left the library with a sense of direction that was not entirely comfortable, but entirely mine. 2 days later, I sat in a waiting room that smelled faintly of toner and coffee. The receptionist had a soft voice and arthritis in her fingers, which made her typing sound like slow rain. When my name was called, I walked into a small office where a man in his 50s looked up from a mountain of folders. His tie was loose, his expression open. I explained carefully about the documents, about the whispers in the operating room, about the letters and the attempts to streamline my life. He didn't interrupt or tilt his head the way my family did when I spoke too long. He just listened, pen motionless in his hand. When I finished, he said, "You're right to act now. They're setting up a living trust that gives them control while you're still alive. It's common." Common. The word lodged in my throat. I had imagined myself a rare fool, but apparently I was one among many. "Can it be undone?" I asked. "It can be prevented," he replied, "and it can be documented." He suggested setting up a small but separate legal entity for my remaining assets, a trust with a neutral executor. I thought of my niece in Vermont, the only one who still wrote letters in cursive and sent photos of her garden without commentary. I gave her name. He nodded, began typing, the rhythm of his fingers suddenly decisive. Paperwork is a kind of resurrection when it's done on your terms. When I left the office, the air felt lighter, the kind of late autumn breeze that carries both endings and a strange sweetness. I walked slowly past the storefronts, letting myself notice the living texture of the city. The child dragging a backpack too big for her shoulders, the dog that barked at its own reflection, the woman arguing gently with her reflection in a shop window as she adjusted her scarf. They were all alive in their imperfection, and I was among them, walking unescorted. For the first time in months, my breath didn't feel borrowed. At home that evening, I made a deliberate mess. I cooked lentils and onions and left the pot on the stove, the smell filling the small apartment until it clung to the curtains. My daughter-in-law hated that smell. She said it was heavy. I kept the windows shut. I ate slowly, thinking of how the word heavy had always been used to describe me, my opinions, my caution, my presence. But heaviness, I realized, is just another name for roots. After dinner, I spread my papers across the table and began sorting them. I found the old file of war bonds my husband had left untouched, the insurance papers, the pension statement, even the deed copies I had hidden behind the stove panel. I laid them out like pieces of a map. They formed a geography of endurance, every signature a road I had walked, every seal a border I had crossed. The phone rang while I worked. I let it. When the machine clicked, I heard my grandson's voice, carefully modulated. "Hey, Grandma. Just checking in. Mom said you might need help organizing things. We can swing by this weekend." I watched the answering light blink, one red pulse at a time, and wondered when concern had become indistinguishable from reconnaissance. I unplugged the phone. Silence, when chosen, is not loneliness. It's a form of ownership. In the following weeks, I cultivated small freedoms with the precision of a gardener pruning stubborn vines. I moved my savings into a local credit union under my own name. I changed the locks. I began taking long walks without destination, refusing to explain them to anyone. The city learned my pace. The crossing guards began to wave. The barista at the corner cafe learned that I took my coffee black, no sugar, and that I paid in cash. People underestimate how quickly the world restores your reflection once you stop asking permission to exist in it. Still, there were moments when fear slipped its thin fingers around my ribs, especially at night when the pipes creaked and I imagined footsteps in the hallway. I kept a small notebook on my bedside table and wrote every worry into it until the words themselves became proof of survival. If you can name a fear, you have already begun to cage it. Sometimes I dreamed of my husband, though not as he was, but as he might have been had he lived long enough to see this unraveling. In the dream, he sat at the end of the bed, polishing his glasses, saying nothing, just nodding once, as if to say, "You've finally remembered." The turning point was not any single revelation, but the cumulative effect of seeing my own handwriting again in official ink. When the lawyer mailed me the notarized confirmation of the new trust, my name written clearly as sole trustee until death, I ran my fingers over the raised seal and felt something loosen in my chest. I thought of the phrase I had heard in the operating room, "Wait till she dies," and realized how small it sounded compared to the solidity of this paper. Death might eventually take my body, but bureaucracy now served my will, not theirs. I laughed then, a dry, startled sound that cracked the quiet apartment. In that laugh was the beginning of a plan. I started to imagine what it would mean to live, not just defensively, but deliberately. The librarian at the desk began setting aside volunteer forms for literacy programs, and one afternoon I filled one out. When she asked if I had experience, I said I had raised children and balanced books before computers learned to spell for us, which seemed qualification enough. The next week, I was teaching a small group of adults how to write letters, real letters, on paper. The first time I handed out envelopes, my hands trembled slightly, but it wasn't weakness. It was the echo of revival. I wrote along with them during the sessions. "Dear me," one of my letters began, "you are not what they counted on. You are still here, unclaimed, unpaid, unburied." My daughter-in-law's calls grew more frequent, her tone sugary but tight. She wanted to know my plans. I told her I was volunteering. She said that was sweet. Sweet is the word people use when they are trying not to scream. My grandson sent a message about visiting to help with bills. I replied that everything was handled. There was a pause of several days, then a text with a single word. "Okay." It looked harmless, but I read it as defeat, a small fracture in their certainty that I was an instrument they could still tune. I began to sleep better. I even started reading the newspaper again, not just the obituaries, which had been my habit during the darker months. There was an article about women over 70 starting businesses, traveling, remarrying. I clipped it and pinned it to the corkboard near my desk, not because I planned to do any of those things, but because it reminded me that possibilities don't expire with approval. The world is still porous if you press hard enough. One evening, as the light faded and the laundry machines below rumbled like distant thunder, I brewed a pot of tea and opened the window. The air smelled of rain and soap and something like courage. Across the street, a young couple were arguing over groceries, their voices rising, raw and alive. I envied them their noise. For so long I had been silent, performing decency as though it were penance. Now I found myself humming, not a song I recognized, but a rhythm my heart had been rehearsing since that day in the operating room. It was the rhythm of continuation. The midpoint of my story arrived not with triumph, but with steadiness. The balance had shifted. I no longer waited for permission to keep what was mine, nor for an apology that would never come. My steps grew sure, my spine straighter. I began signing my full name on everything again, the old-fashioned cursive that loops like thread and refuses to break. I wrote it on forms, on checks, on the inside cover of the books I borrowed, as if to declare, quietly but irrevocably, that I still belonged to myself. And when the phone rang late one night, and I heard my daughter-in-law's voice tight with suspicion, asking, "Why didn't you tell us you were making changes?" I said very softly, "Because I was awake this time." Then I hung up, turned off the light, and let the city breathe with me in the dark. It began again, as things always do, when those who feel entitled to your silence realize they have lost their grip. Their politeness grew brighter, sharper, and more fragile, like a porcelain mask just before it cracks. My daughter-in-law started calling every morning at 9, her voice deliberately cheerful, the tone of someone managing a volunteer shift rather than speaking to a human being. "Good morning, dear. How are we feeling today?" she would ask, the plural a small poison. The calls were not about affection, they were inventory. She was checking to make sure the asset was still alive. I answered her with the same calm detachment I had perfected in my years at the office, when men twice my age would explain my own reports back to me. I let her fill the silence with instructions disguised as questions. Had I taken my medication? Had I eaten breakfast? Had I thought about downsizing yet? Downsizing, a word I now associated with burial. I thanked her, hung up, and recorded each call in a small notebook, noting the time, the phrases, the pauses. It felt strange at first, but the habit gave me rhythm, a sense of control. Each line of ink was a witness to their choreography of concern. The real pressure began when my grandson returned from college early to help out. He arrived with that careless confidence particular to young men who mistake youth for wisdom. He carried boxes of my old files into the living room and began sorting them on the rug without asking. "Mom says we should digitize this stuff," he announced, already plugging in a portable scanner. When I told him to stop, he laughed. "Don't worry, Grandma. I'm not touching your secrets." But of course, that's exactly what he was touching. I sat in my chair and watched him handle the artifacts of my life. Letters, receipts, certificates, as if they were obsolete technology to be updated. I saw how he smirked when he found the photo of me with his grandfather in front of our first house, how he lifted the picture like evidence of a primitive age. "That car's a fossil," he said, and I thought of answering that. At least it had taken us places. Instead, I rose, took the picture from his hands, and said evenly, "You don't scan memory. You listen to it." The words confused him. He shrugged, packed up the scanner, and left the files scattered. After he was gone, I gathered each paper, smoothing them with slow fingers, aware that one day these fragile sheets might be the only proof that I had existed on my own terms. A week later, they arrived together, daughter-in-law and grandson, with a social worker in tow. They had warned me vaguely about a quick visit, but I hadn't expected an inspection. The woman was polite, her hair pinned back so tightly it seemed to pull her thoughts taut. She smiled and asked if she could come in. Behind her, my family hovered like stagehands waiting for cues. Just routine, the social worker said. A wellness assessment for seniors living alone. She spoke the word seniors with the reverence people reserve for extinct species. I invited them in. I served tea. I even smiled. She walked through my apartment, noting things in her tablet: the loose railing by the window, the uneven rug, the absence of grab bars in the bathroom. My daughter-in-law murmured about how worried she'd been about my safety. The grandson scrolled his phone. I waited until the social worker asked the inevitable question. "Do you ever forget to take your medication?" I looked her in the eye and recited each prescription by name, dosage, and refill date. Then, before she could recover, I added the Latin motto of my school and the line of Tennyson I had once carved into my desk as a girl. Though much is taken, much abides. She blinked, unsure whether to record that. "So, your memory is good," she said finally. "Better than my family's," I answered. The silence that followed was worth every ache in my knees. When they left, my daughter-in-law lingered at the door, her smile trembling. "You didn't have to be defensive," she said softly. "We're just trying to help." I closed the door gently and turned the lock. After that day, the visits stopped abruptly, replaced by a new tactic: distance wrapped in guilt. Weeks passed without calls, then suddenly a text would arrive, always late in the evening. "Thinking of you. We miss you. Are you eating well?" Each message was a thread designed to pull me back into their net of obligation. I replied rarely, and when I did, my words were measured and unyielding. "I am well. I have company. Please don't worry." It was true. I had begun to build a life beyond their surveillance. The librarian who had helped me with the papers invited me to her house for dinner one night. Her daughter, a shy teenager with ink on her fingers, asked if I could help her with a French assignment. Sitting at that kitchen table, the smell of roasted garlic in the air, I felt something like belonging, but different, quieter, earned without pretense. They didn't look at me as fragile. They asked questions and waited for my answers. When I left that evening, the girl handed me a folded note she had written in uncertain cursive. "Merci pour la lumière." Thank you for the light. I carried that paper in my wallet next to my lawyer's card. It reminded me that illumination was contagious. Once you find it, others see it too. My daughter-in-law must have sensed the shift, because her next call came with urgency disguised as affection. "We're planning a family dinner next Sunday," she said. "Everyone will be there. It would mean a lot if you came." I heard the tension under the words, the need to reassert normalcy, to photograph us around a table as proof that harmony had been restored. I agreed, curious to see what script they would perform next. The evening unfolded like a play I had already read. The house gleamed. The table was set with the good china I had given them for their wedding. My grandson greeted me with exaggerated warmth, a performance of redemption. The conversation circled safely around weather and recipes until dessert, when my daughter-in-law placed an envelope beside my plate. "Just some papers we forgot to sign last time," she said, her tone breezy. I didn't touch it. I sipped my coffee and asked about her work, about his studies, about the dog. The envelope sat between us like a living thing. After a while, she couldn't stand it. "It's just standard authorization," she said, "to make sure bills are paid if something happens." I smiled and said, "Something already happened." She blinked, not understanding. You spoke while I was still breathing. I stood then, slowly, my knees complaining but obedient. I took the envelope, tore it cleanly in half, and placed the pieces back on the table. "Dinner was lovely," I said, "but I think I'll head home." The room was silent except for the faint tick of the wall clock. I walked out before anyone found the courage to speak. That night, back in my apartment, the adrenaline turned to tremor. My hands shook so badly I spilled tea on the table. But beneath the fear was something else. Clarity, the kind that burns clean. I realized confrontation is not the end of a battle, but the invitation to its next act. I expected retaliation, and it came quickly. 2 days later, my landlord knocked, holding a letter from the family's lawyer claiming concerns about competency and requesting information about my lease. He looked embarrassed, said he was legally obliged to notify me. I thanked him, took the letter, and told him I would handle it. When I called my lawyer, his voice was calm but firm. "They're escalating," he said. "You have documentation, and will file a notice to protect your rights." I sat with that phrase, "protect your rights," rolling it around like a stone in my mouth. It tasted unfamiliar, but strong. The following week, I received an email from my grandson, longer than usual, apologizing for misunderstandings and begging for a meeting to talk things through. I almost deleted it, but something in the tone, half pleading, half rehearsed, made me curious. We met at a small cafe near the river. He looked different, paler, as if he hadn't slept. He ordered for me without asking, a gesture so practiced it was almost kind, and then he began. "Mom's worried," he said. "She thinks you're making rash decisions. She doesn't want you to get taken advantage of." I asked by whom. He hesitated. "People who pretend to help, lawyers, charities, even that librarian lady." I smiled then, not out of amusement, but pity. "The difference," I said, "is that those people see me." He looked down at his hands, the same hands I had once held crossing the street, small and sticky with candy. "You used to trust us," he said quietly. "You used to be grateful." The word grateful stung more than any insult. Gratitude to them meant obedience. I leaned forward and said, "I was never yours to grant permission to. I trusted the idea of family. You mistook it for ownership." He had no answer. When I stood to leave, he asked softly, "Are you changing your will?" I turned back just long enough to say, "I already did." After that meeting, the messages stopped altogether. The silence they left behind was enormous, but it did not crush me. It echoed. It gave me room to think, to plan, to move without commentary. I threw myself into the library work, teaching adults to write letters, helping children spell their names for the first time. The act of guiding a pencil in another's hand became a quiet form of prayer. One evening, after class, the librarian pressed a small, wrapped package into my palm. Inside was a fountain pen, heavy, beautifully balanced. "For your stories," she said. I laughed and told her I had none worth writing, but she shook her head. Everyone who survives has a story worth writing. I took the pen home and placed it on my desk beside the old photograph of my husband. For days I could not bring myself to use it. Then one night I began to write. Not a letter, not a confession, but a record. Every detail, every insult disguised as kindness, every attempt to erase me. I wrote until my hand ached and the page shimmered with tears I hadn't realized had fallen. When I finished, I signed my full name and locked the notebook in the drawer with my legal papers. The family returned one last time in early spring, when the first magnolia buds appeared along the street. They came unannounced, carrying bright flowers and a box of pastries, as if to offer peace. My daughter-in-law spoke first, her voice low, careful. "We were harsh," she admitted. "Things got out of hand. We just want to make sure we're still family." I looked at her, at the nervous smile that failed to hide calculation. "Family," I said slowly, "is what you build, not what you inherit." She nodded, pretending to understand. My grandson stood behind her, silent, watching me with an expression I couldn't read. I offered them tea. They stayed exactly 19 minutes, long enough to deliver their performance and gauge my reaction. When they left, the flowers remained on the table, bright but scentless. I threw them away the next morning. Their final move came in the form of paperwork again, a request for mediation sent through their attorney. It was phrased as a family settlement conference, the sort of legal euphemism that tries to sound gentle while carrying a knife behind its back. I brought the letter to my lawyer, who advised attending only if I wished to make a statement. I said I did. The meeting took place in a sterile room with beige walls and no windows. Across the table they sat, polished and impatient. The mediator, a young man with the expression of someone already late for lunch, asked if we sought reconciliation. I said no. "I seek recognition," I told him. "I want it on record that I am of sound mind, that I refuse to relinquish control of my estate, and that I heard every word spoken outside that surgery curtain." The color drained from my daughter-in-law's face. "You're mistaken," she whispered. I smiled. I was awake. That's not something one imagines. My grandson looked away, his jaw tight. The mediator cleared his throat, scribbled something, and declared the session concluded. I left without shaking hands. Walking out into the bright afternoon, I felt the air hit me like a baptism. The city noise roared around me, car horns, footsteps, fragments of conversation, and for the first time in years, I felt part of it. The fight was not over. I knew they would not surrender quietly. But they could no longer rewrite the narrative. The story, at last, belonged to me. I carried that realization home like a fragile flame, cupping it carefully against the wind. That night, when I opened my window and heard the faint laughter of people on the street below, I realized that the sound no longer hurt. It was life continuing, and I was still in it, awake, unowned, unafraid. The day I executed my plan began with rain. That kind of slow, deliberate rain that seems to think before it falls, as if testing each drop for purpose. I woke early, long before the alarm, and sat by the window watching the streetlights melt into the wet pavement. My spider plant bent slightly toward the gray light, its leaves heavy with dust and neglect, yet still reaching, stubborn as ever. I decided it would come with me. I boiled water for tea, not because I wanted it, but because rituals steady the hands. Every motion that morning felt ceremonial. The folding of my coat, the buttoning of my blouse, the check of the documents in the leather folder that had once belonged to my husband. The rain made a soft percussion against the glass as I packed, a rhythm that carried the promise of erasure and renewal. I had already sold the apartment the week before, quietly, through the same lawyer who had helped me reclaim my estate. The new owner, a kind woman from the Historical Society, planned to turn it into a community reading room for retired teachers. When she came to sign the papers, she brought her daughter, a young mother with a sleeping infant. I remember the baby's breath, tiny, uneven, alive, and I thought, life does not end, it transfers. The money had gone directly into a trust under my niece's name. I would leave nothing behind for those who waited for my death like a delayed payday. What they called inheritance, I now called liberation. That morning, I called a cab instead of my daughter-in-law, though I imagined she would feel the disturbance like a spider sensing movement in the web. The driver was a woman in her 60s, with silver hair pulled into a neat braid. She glanced at me in the mirror and said, "You're traveling light." I told her I had learned the weight of unnecessary things. She smiled, nodded, and turned up the radio, where an old ballad played about leaving a place quietly. As the car pulled away from the curb, I looked once at the laundromat sign, flickering below my window. The same neon hum that had accompanied my solitude, and whispered goodbye. I had lived there long enough for silence to become a language, and now I was fluent enough to translate it back into movement. At the lawyer's office, everything smelled of paper and rain-soaked wool. He greeted me with a warmth that did not intrude, only steadied. "It's all ready," he said. "Once you sign, it's irreversible." Irreversible. Such a comforting word when you have spent years being undone. I took the pen he offered, a fountain pen identical to the one the librarian had given me, and signed my name with a slowness that was almost reverence. Each letter curved and unfurled like breath after a long-held silence. When the last stroke dried, he stood, extended his hand, and said, "Congratulations. You've just rewritten the ending." I thanked him, but my voice trembled slightly. I think I hadn't yet realized the full weight of freedom. It is heavier than chains, at least at first. He asked where I would go next. "North," I said, "to family." He nodded, understanding the kind of family that word implied. As I left the office, the rain had stopped, leaving the city rinsed and sharp-edged. I walked to the bus station instead of taking another cab. I wanted to feel the ground beneath me, to sense the stubborn pulse of a city that had seen too many women like me fade into the wallpaper of their children's lives. At the counter, I bought a ticket to Vermont, to my niece's small town with its mapled hills and the promise of anonymity. The clerk printed it with a mechanical whir that sounded like applause. I sat on a bench, the leather folder resting in my lap, and waited for the departure call. It was then, as the crowd swelled and shifted around me, that I saw them, my daughter-in-law and grandson, walking quickly, scanning the terminal. The sight of them didn't shock me. Some part of me had known they would come. The lawyer had called to confirm the transaction. Perhaps the echo of that call had reached them through the cracks of gossip or surveillance. They hadn't expected me to move so soon, but greed has good hearing. They spotted me within moments. My daughter-in-law's heels clicked sharply as she approached, her smile stretched thin as paper. "What are you doing?" she demanded, not loudly, but with the tone of someone whose possession has escaped. "Traveling," I said. "You didn't tell us." "I wasn't required to." My grandson hung back, pale, avoiding my gaze. "You can't just leave," she said, voice trembling now. "We need to talk about this, about the accounts." I stood slowly, feeling the stiffness in my knees, but not surrendering to it. "There's nothing to discuss," I replied. "The accounts are closed. The trust is active. Everything is settled." Her mouth opened, closed. "You're making a mistake," she whispered. "You'll regret this." "Perhaps," I said, "but at least the regret will be mine." She reached for my arm, but I stepped back. "You don't understand," she said. "After everything we've done for you." I laughed then, a sound that startled even me. Everything you've done to me, you mean? You mistook endurance for consent. For a moment, I thought she might slap me. The air between us quivered with that possibility. But she didn't. She straightened, smoothing her jacket. "You're old," she said finally, her voice low. "You won't last long up there." "Then you won't have to wait much longer," I answered. Her eyes flickered, a flash of hatred she couldn't quite swallow. My grandson shifted uncomfortably, muttered something about letting me go, but she turned on him sharply, saying, "Don't you dare." He looked at me then, and for a fleeting second, I saw in his face the boy who once drew me pictures of rockets and dragons. He whispered, "Are you sure you want to do this?" I nodded. Completely. The bus driver called for boarding. I stepped toward the door, but before I could climb the steps, I turned back and said, "If you ever speak of me again, tell the truth. Say I heard you. Say I lived long enough to decide." Then I handed the driver my ticket and walked onto the bus. As we pulled away, I saw them through the window. Two figures standing in the drizzle, the grandson's shoulders slumped, the daughter-in-law's posture brittle as glass. They looked small, almost childlike in their confusion. For a moment, I felt something close to pity. Then I remembered the sound of their voices through the surgical haze, that casual cruelty of planning a death that hadn't yet occurred, and the pity evaporated. The road stretched ahead, wet and glistening, the mountains in the distance veiled in mist. I rested my head against the window and let the vibration of the bus lull me into a state between waking and memory. Somewhere along the way, as the landscape shifted from concrete to forest, I took the folded notebook from my bag and began to write again. Not a record this time, but a declaration. I wrote that I had sold the house to a historical society so that laughter and learning might live there again. I wrote that I had left no inheritance to those who measured my worth in property lines and closing costs. I wrote that I had chosen my niece as my executor because she had once sent me a postcard with the words, "Wish you were here," written without irony. And I wrote that even if the world forgets my name, the sound of that whisper in the operating room will remain my proof of existence. I was awake then, and I am awake now, and perhaps being awake is the only immortality that matters. When the bus crossed into Vermont, the rain turned to snow. The driver switched on the interior lights, bathing the cabin in a soft yellow glow. I looked around at the passengers, farmhands, students, an old couple sleeping against each other, and realized I was exactly where I belonged, among travelers, not relics. I closed the notebook and placed it in the folder with the documents. Outside, the snow thickened, erasing the edges of the world until everything looked clean, unowned, and new. By the time we arrived, the storm had settled into a steady fall. My niece was waiting at the station, her coat buttoned up to her chin, her breath visible in the cold air. When she saw me, she waved, her eyes bright and wet. "You made it," she said as she hugged me. And for the first time in years, I believed the words. We drove through the quiet town, the headlights carving tunnels in the snow. Her house stood at the edge of a small orchard, a converted barn with wide windows and the smell of cedar. Inside, a fire crackled, and on the mantel sat a photograph of her mother, my sister, smiling in the garden we once tended as girls. The sight of it broke something open in me, but not painfully. It was release. That night, after she went to bed, I sat alone by the fire, the leather folder beside me. I opened it one last time, checked the signatures, the seals, the will. Everything was in order. I took out the fountain pen and wrote a final letter, addressed simply to whoever reads this after I'm gone. In it, I explained nothing and confessed everything. That silence is a form of death, that trust can be a weapon, and that waking up, in any sense of the word, is always worth the pain it brings. I signed it, folded it carefully, and slipped it between the pages of the notebook. The fire crackled softly. The snow thickened against the windows, and for the first time in a very long time, I felt warm without trembling. Outside, the world kept falling softly into itself, each flake erasing another trace of the road behind me. I understood then that freedom isn't the absence of fear. It's the choice to keep walking despite it. I closed my eyes, listening to the sound of the wind moving through the trees, and whispered, not to anyone in particular, "It's done." And it was. Morning came quietly, as if it had been waiting outside my window all night, listening for my breathing before deciding to enter. The snow had stopped, leaving the world painted in shades of silver and white, so complete it felt indecent to disturb it. My niece's house was still, the fire in the hearth reduced to a faint glow that pulsed like the memory of warmth. I sat in the armchair by the window, wrapped in a blanket she had knitted herself, the kind of heavy wool that holds the scent of its maker, and watched the faint line of smoke rise from a neighboring chimney. The silence was not empty anymore. It was full, dense, almost sacred. I felt it move through me the way breath fills the lungs after too many shallow attempts. I thought of all the mornings I had woken before dawn in other houses, waiting for a sound that would tell me I was still needed. A child's cry, a husband's cough, the creak of someone calling my name, and realized that this waiting had been my whole life's posture. Now there was no one to wait for, and no one waiting for me, and the absence was not grief, but something closer to grace. My niece joined me with 2 mugs of coffee and sat cross-legged on the rug, her hair unbrushed, her face open in that effortless way youth sometimes has when it hasn't yet been taught to defend itself. She asked if I had slept, and I told her yes. Better than in years. "You're safe here," she said simply, and there was no claim in her voice, only fact. Safety is a strange sensation when you've lived without it. It doesn't arrive like thunder. It seeps into your bones quietly until you realize the muscles you've kept tensed for decades have begun to soften. I watched her sip her coffee, her hands steady, and thought of all the daughters I had imagined raising, the versions of myself I had tried to preserve through others, and how she, without even meaning to, had become the answer to a prayer I'd stopped speaking. Over the following days, I found a rhythm that didn't feel borrowed. I helped her sort the books she was collecting for the small local library, labeling each spine with neat, steady letters. The librarian, the same woman who had once helped me in the city, had written to her recommending me as a volunteer. "Said you have a gift for details," my niece told me with a smile, and I felt a small, surprised flush of pride. It was strange to be known again, not as a burden, but as a contributor. I began teaching cursive to children from the town who came on Saturdays, their pencils clumsy but eager. Watching their fingers struggle to form loops and tails reminded me that learning to shape letters is really learning to control one's own voice. One of the girls, a quiet, red-haired child, asked one afternoon why people write their names on everything. I told her, because sometimes the world forgets we exist if we don't leave a mark. She nodded solemnly and signed her name 3 times across the page. Letters became my new ritual. Each morning, I wrote one, not to send, but to keep. A letter to the past versions of myself, to the silenced woman in the hospital bed, to the one who stood trembling in front of lawyers, to the one who finally walked away. I addressed them all, sealed them, and placed them in a wooden box by the window. It comforted me to imagine that someday, after I'm gone, someone might find them and understand that survival is not a single act, but a long conversation with your own ghost. My niece once caught me writing and asked, half joking, "Who are you telling all your secrets to?" I smiled and said, "To the women who will need them." Occasionally, the old world still tried to find me. A letter arrived one afternoon from my former daughter-in-law, the envelope thick, the handwriting tight and elegant. She wrote that she hoped I was well, that she had heard through some network that I was settled up north, that there were still unresolved matters we should discuss. I folded the letter neatly and burned it in the fireplace. The paper curled quickly, releasing a smell like dust and perfume. Watching it vanish gave me no joy, only a calm confirmation that endings don't always require applause. Some stories dissolve quietly, like smoke through a chimney, leaving behind air that is cleaner for the absence. Spring came slowly that year, shy and late. The snow melted into rivulets that carved soft channels through the orchard, and the trees began to swell with buds the color of old ivory. I walked the rows every morning, feeling the damp soil under my shoes, remembering how long it had been since I had walked without purpose. The air carried the faint sound of children from the nearby school, their laughter high and uncontained. Once, that sound used to wound me. It reminded me of what I'd lost, what had calcified between me and the people I loved. Now it sounded like the world continuing as it should, a melody that didn't need me to exist, but was richer because I could still hear it. One afternoon, I sat at the kitchen table and opened the leather folder one last time. Inside were the documents, the will, the trust papers, the letter to whoever would read it after I was gone. Everything was in perfect order. I placed the librarian's fountain pen on top of the stack, its black ink half full, and closed the clasp. I realized I no longer needed to guard these papers. They had served their purpose. I had already reclaimed what mattered most, the right to finish my life in my own voice. I sealed the folder in a parcel and wrote my niece's name on it, instructing her not to open it until after my passing. She tried to protest, but I told her gently that preparation is not surrender. It is clarity. In the evenings, we often sat on the porch, wrapped in blankets, watching the sun slide down behind the hills, the sky turning the same bruised purple I used to fear as a child, because it meant another day gone. Now I found it beautiful, the color of completion. Sometimes my niece would read aloud from the letters I'd written to the children at the library, letters about patience, about paying attention, about never mistaking kindness for permission. One night, she looked up from the page and said, "Do you ever think about them?" I knew who she meant. "Not really," I said. "They'll have to live with what they did. I already lived through it." She reached out, squeezed my hand, and said nothing more. That night I dreamed I was back in the operating room, but this time the light above me was soft, and the voices I heard were my own. They were reading aloud every letter I had ever written, every word I had refused to say then. When I woke, the first light of dawn was touching the walls of the room, and for a moment I didn't know if I was in the past or the present. It didn't matter. Both belong to me now. I've often thought since then that forgiveness is not about those who hurt you. It's about releasing the part of yourself that waited for them to understand. I don't need understanding anymore. I have peace, which is rarer and quieter and infinitely more sustaining. Sometimes, when I walk to the library and the children wave from the steps, I feel an ache that isn't sorrow, but recognition. I see in their faces the promise of a future that might treat its elders not as burdens to be managed, but as witnesses to be heard. If even one of them remembers that lesson, it will be enough. And so I live, gently now, in this small town, where my name means nothing, but still carries weight when I sign it at the bottom of a letter. I water my plant every morning. It's larger than ever, its leaves full and green, proof that survival loves attention. I make tea at dawn, not because I'm waiting for anyone, but because the sound of the kettle reminds me I'm still here. Sometimes I think of that whispered sentence from the operating room, their greedy little prophecy, and I smile. They were wrong. I did not die. I simply woke up, and I never went back to sleep.